Hi, I'm David Dodge. Welcome to Green Energy Futures. On April 28, 2025, a catastrophic blackout left 50 million people in Spain in the dark when 15 gigawatts of power vanished from the grid in seconds. Pundits were quick to weigh in, and many blamed renewable energy. I was commissioned to do a story on the Spanish Blackouts by the Earth and I magazine based in Washington, D.C. We knew this would require a fair amount of research, and the only person I wanted to interview before the official report was released was Michael Liebreich, an energy expert from Britain. We spoke with Michael Liebreich before the official report came out in late June, and it turns out it wasn't renewable energy that crashed the Spanish grid. Michael said this in our discussion, and the report confirmed it when it came out recently. We wanted to talk to Michael about what could cause such a catastrophic blackout and what needs to be done to modernize our rapidly changing grids around the world as energy transition proceeds at pace and thousands, if not millions, of decentralized energy sources are added to the grid. This is our layman's guide to grid speak, and we present a surprisingly simple and pragmatic solution for integrating cheap renewable energy into our electricity grids. Michael Liebreich is an investor and advisor who founded Bloomberg New Energy Finance.
So hello, I'm Michael Liebreich. I do a whole load of stuff around commentating and speaking about the net zero transition, all the technologies, transport, energy, and infrastructure, and so on. I'm also an investor and an advisor. And for those of you who work in the sector, you might know that I was the founder of what is now Bloomberg New Energy Finance, the leading information provider, which I sold to Bloomberg many years ago, and I still do some writing for them. Oh, and I'm the host of Cleaning Up, my podcast and YouTube channel, and I'm also the author of the Thoughts of Chairman Michael on Substack.
Well, and thanks for the Bloomberg New Energy, because we all use that. So,
me too. I'm so glad that we had a sort of freemium model because I still get to use it.
So, remind us what happened. We're going to zero in on a very particular issue that came from Spain recently. Remind us what happened on was it April 28th or April 29th in Spain?
April 28th. And the simple version is there was a horrendous power cut that swept across the Iberian Peninsula. And for any listeners who don't know what the Iberian Peninsula is, it's basically Spain and Portugal. What you've got is most of continental Europe, and then hanging off the side of it, you've got the Iberian Peninsula, which is connected obviously to France, but there's mountains and there's not very strong electrical connection. So that whole peninsula went dark very quickly, and they were brilliant at bringing it back, getting it back online within about 12 hours. People were back getting electricity. It was a very traumatic event. A few people sadly passed away because power cuts are very dangerous, but they brought it back fairly quickly.
So let's just ask it directly, just like you did of your guest on your podcast. So was the cause renewables?
Okay, so was it renewables? Great question. So I don't have the data exactly for Portugal, but Spain, if I'm allowed to refer to my little cheat sheet here, had gone from 18% renewables in 2004, so 20 years ago, which is when I started New Energy Finance, as was then. I was starting in this, 18%, and it's gone to 57% renewable electricity, this is, by last year. And if you look at the moment, in fact, let's go back, do this in stages. A few weeks before that power cut, all of the fans of renewables were tremendously excited because there had been a new record, which was that, first of all, Spain, more than 100% of its power during the week, not on a weekend, not on a quiet day, but more than 100% had been delivered by variable wind and solar. And there had been this new record, which is the solar alone, a few days later had gone through 78%. 78%, everybody's tremendously happy. And then, of course, 2 weeks later, you had the power cut. And the finger is pointed at renewables because wind and solar don't provide what are called grid stability services. So there's a whole bunch of things that you need to do beyond just dumping electricity into the system in order to provide enough electricity to meet the demand. You have to do some very specific things to manage the voltage, to manage the frequency, to deal with all sorts of harmonics and artifacts across this incredibly complex system. And also, if you have a fault on the system, you need something called short circuit current. You also need, if the thing goes down, you need black start capability. In other words, if you want to start playing a tune again, you need the drummer to start first. And if you haven't got any drummers, you can't start playing a tune, right? So the grid needs these services, and wind and solar don't provide them. And so everybody pointed the finger and said, there you go, that's the culprit. Sorry, and you asked the question, are they the culprit? And the answer, of course, is no.
And you looked into this recently, or you had some thoughts about this, and actually did a little research, I believe, with your buddy called ChatGPT, to look into previous, severe events like the one in Texas. And what did you learn about renewables being blamed and whether they were the cause?
Right. So the history shows that every time now that there's a disruption to the grid, a power cut or a big concern or a near miss, renewables gets blamed. And that's because they're the new kid on the block. And they also threaten a whole load of incumbents. There are a lot of players that don't like the idea of a switch to lots of renewables. And frankly, there's a lot of people who just, it's kind of entertaining to, a pile on in social media is always fun, right? So if there's going to be a blame game, and what we've seen is, you mentioned the power cut in Texas, and this was, I think, 2021, February. And immediately everybody said, there you go, it's because Texas has built all this wind, stupid Texas. And it turned out it was to do with things like the coal, the piles of stored coal that had frozen, or that they had not winterized the gas pumping station. So you need to pump gas. So, okay, if the wind isn't there and the solar isn't there, then that's kind of should be foreseen because they are variable resources. That's why you have a mix. So what went wrong was not the wind and the solar, it was actually the gas that couldn't be pumped to the power stations. So it's cold, but to warm things up, you need the gas, but then the pumping stations aren't working because you didn't winterize them. And there's a pattern. We saw also in 2016, South Australia, which has really, within Australia, has pioneered lots of wind, lots of solar, and making, by the way, a lot of people in Australia, a lot of the coal industry and a lot of the sort of fossil, how can I put it? There's a lot of money being made by exporting fossil fuels to China. So anything that threatens that business model is comes in for a lot of flack. And so immediately there was this power outage, and the finger was pointed at wind. And then this sort of picture started to filter through of what had happened to the pylons. There'd been a storm. There's all these pylons are down, and it's almost exactly nothing to do with wind. And this is a pattern. We've seen this time and again now. There's a disruption or a power cut, and the renewables gets blamed. When I said it's not their fault, there is a nuance. And that is that the way that we have managed the grids in the past, it's been optimized for a lot of fossil generation, also nuclear, and you can do without that, but you have to be intentional. You have to have a plan. And the grid operators, I'm very familiar with the work done by first National Grid, but then that's been handed over to the National Electricity System Operator now. It's been separated out. They've been working for years on how do you provide this thing called inertia, lots of spinning. It doesn't have to be spinning, but the old power generators, gas, coal, and also nuclear, where it's still on the grid, and Spain is trying to remove nuclear as well. When you have these big spinning generators and spinning power, the engine and the generator, the turbine and the generator, then it slows everything down, right? So when you suddenly lose a bit of supply or there's some unexpected demand, these things take a while to change speed. So all of the software has longer to intervene, et cetera, et cetera. You can do without the spinning bit, but you can't do without a plan, There are other ways. You can provide some of that through batteries. You can have things that spin that don't generate power, called synchrons or synchronous condensers, but you have to build them. And somebody has to pay for them. So you don't have to have fossil fuels. That's not the issue, but you do have to have a plan.
You talked about this in your podcast a little bit, but it's kind of interesting that all these things happened at once. Like they lost 60% of their power in 5 seconds. Why would that all happen at the same time? And what do we do about that?
Right. So let me just say one thing right now. We don't know the full official version. Okay. This grid is incredibly complex because it's not just the Spanish grid or the Portuguese and Spanish that you need to understand. You need to understand the French one because it was connected. But the French is connected right across Europe, all the way up to the Baltic republics, right? Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, which were connected to Russia, and relatively recently, I think in February, were connected to the whole thing. So you really need to understand the whole, and it's a bit like sort of Chinese medicine. You've got a headache and it's because you're not walking right, and they do acupuncture on your foot and suddenly the headache goes. So these systems, they're incredibly complex, and what the European grid is trying to do is to keep the same frequency across the whole thing, all the way from the Baltic republics down to the edge of Portugal, and of course down into the Balkans as well. So and you've got these things like harmonics. The thing can start galloping and weird. Another analogy would be the heart rhythms. You can have arrhythmias in your heart because electrical signals are bouncing around. And this is exactly the sort of stuff that happens on this system. So first of all, there was a bunch of that going on, this kind of weird artifacts, harmonics, frequencies bouncing around. And those, instead of being damped out by the control mechanisms, by the inertia, by the software, by the batteries, by whatever, those bouncings around kind of amplified until it looks like, we don't know yet, some resources switched off. And then the French they cut the link because otherwise it would have harmed the frequency in France and so on. And in fact, I think one power station also dropped out in France, so they were kind of dealing with that. But what happened very, very quickly was suddenly 15 gigawatts of plants shut in Spain. And to put that in perspective, France's whole system is only, 30 gigawatts at this point, or 30, 35, something like that. So a huge amount switched off. Why? And we don't know because the report's not been written. But it looks very likely that those plants, to protect themselves from damage, were all set to switch off at the same frequency, right? So, and of course, so instead of saying, "Oh, this is getting a bit worse, let's 3 more switch off," or one gig, 2 gig, 3 gig, suddenly it was 15 gig because they all seem to have had the same settings. And these are the sorts of things that we need to learn, and the grid operator will need to change the codes and say, right, we will next time when there's a problem, instead of it going, a kind of holy moly and all switching off at once, it will progressively switch off and also switch off at the same time as demand. So shut down some factories, shut down demand, so that you can kind of bring the two back into balance. When you have 15 gigawatts shut down at once, there's nothing you can do. The whole lot's gone. Then the grid is unstable and you're going back to zero and having to do what's called a black start.
So these terms we hear a lot about, and like inertia and the frequency, frequency is kind of a kissing cousin of inertia. Is that right? Like, is there a simple explanation for that? Like why that's important?
Well, so inertia, I love inertia because what happened is, there's all these commentators now. They're enormous experts on inertia. These are the same people who, 5 years ago, they suddenly became enormous experts on, on coronaviruses. And then 3 years ago, they became expert on weapons systems. And now suddenly they're experts on inertia. But inertia, this is deep electrical engineering. The people who really understand this is not even, I'm a mechanical engineer. I have a lot of energy engineering, but you really, the professionals are the electrical engineers and the grid, the ones that specifically do work on the grid. So frequency is, all of our stuff operates at 50 hertz. Other systems have got 60 hertz. Japan, amazingly, has two systems across the main island, 150 and 160. Don't ask why. It's all about history. And what happens is all of our equipment is designed to work at 50 or very close to it, right? And so that's just and then obviously at a certain voltage as well. So we've got here in the UK 240, Europe 220, which is approximately very close to being the same thing. US, Canada 110. So you've got to have, to make everything work, you need to keep that whole grid, you need to keep it at 50 hertz frequency and the voltage 220, 240, 110, whatever the system is supposed to. And then all of the equipment that will be happy within a certain tolerance. So you can have now when you put a big load on the grid, then the frequency will drop because everything slows down. It's like going uphill in your car and the engine sort of has to work harder and things will slow down. And then when you reach the top of the hill, it will start to speed up. So think of it as it's almost like what you've got on this grid is almost like speed, like a autopilot or speed control on a car. It doesn't exactly keep the right speed. It will fluctuate a little bit. And what inertia does is it stops those fluctuations being so large that they cause problems. So, if you put the speed control on your car at 60 miles an hour, because you don't want to break the law, 60 miles an hour, if they fluctuate between 59 and 61, you won't get a ticket. Right? If they start fluctuating from 55 to 65, you could get a ticket. Inertia stops that from happening. Right? Inertia, there's generally big spinning resources, stop it from speeding up and slowing down and the voltage being all over the place. But there are other things that you need. The electrical engineers will say, well, that's all very well, but you have other things. All these sort of sudden experts, these commentators, they've never heard of things like short circuit current or some of the black start, the ability to play the drums and allow the whole system to come back up at the right frequency. So there's all these other, they're just called grid services or ancillary services. And the grid operator around the world, what they will have is a list of 10 or 12 of them, not just inertia, but there's 10 or 12 sort of buckets. I'll give you another one, which, again, these commentators have never heard of, which is ROCOF, ROCOF, ROCOF. What is ROCOF? ROCOF is rate of change of frequency. It's not just the frequency, it's how quickly the frequency is changing. So there are specific technologies that will help, that will slow down. So your frequency is allowed to go down, maybe, from 50 hertz to 49.8, but not too quickly. So you need ROCOF control. You need something called reactive power. I mean, ask your average commentator, arts grad commentator, if they've even heard of reactive power, let alone how you actually sort of apply it to the grid. And that's all to do with you've got three phases and you've got to, you've got capacitance and inductance, and I can come up with all these terms. We'll lose your audience. So the main message is there's a complicated set of things that your grid operator is doing to the best of their ability, and that most people, in 99.9% of the population, has absolutely no idea that they're doing them. Coming back to renewables and what happened, I think the main point is not that if you have renewables or a lot of renewables, you can't provide those services, you can't be stable. As I say, you just need a plan. You need to know that if you remove that nuclear power station and those coal-fired power stations and those big gas power stations, you need to add something else back in that can keep everything kind of humming along. And of course, those things might cost a bit of money, but they have to be planned for. They're not that expensive, but they do need to be planned for. And that's what we'll learn when the report comes out.
Yeah.
It's going to have a whole list of things to do with trip settings, to do with inertia, to do with reactive power, to do with harmonics. I mean, we haven't talked about data, right?
Yeah.
How quickly were they, how well and how quickly were they amassing data? So how soon did they know there was a problem? when this thing started galloping and there were these frequency divergences between, I don't know, Latvia and Spain, did that trigger the system to go, whoa, we should probably do X or do Y, or did it just sit there kind of running blind? And particularly with AI now, we can monitor how many places are they monitoring frequency, right? 6 places in Europe, 50 places in Europe, or 5 million places in Europe, which AI could do, and only AI. So there's a huge amount that we're going to learn. And that one other historical lesson is that after these events, we become smart, which sort of sounds like, well, it'd be nice to be smart beforehand, but actually we learn from every one of these events. So what we learn in Spain, they will be using in Australia, in the US, right across Europe, in China, in Asia, and of course also, you have to hope, in Canada.
Well, as you said, we saw some of those oscillations before the actual outage, but renewables normally have an issue we deal with. I mean, Spain has run on 100% renewables, like you said, 2 weeks before that. So when the sun goes behind a cloud, which of those factors does that affect, and how are we dealing with that normally?
Well, so when Spain ran on 100%, I suspect, I'll be honest, I haven't dived in at that level of detail. I suspect what it was really doing is running on 120%. It was producing 120%, exporting a bunch via its links to, it's got links to Portugal, it's got a link down to North Africa, and it's got links through to France. So it wasn't doing just renewables, but it also, a piece of their renewables, a big chunk, is hydro, right? Hydro spins. So hydro very cheaply and easily provides some of those stability services. So that's how they've done it. So I think one of the things we will learn is about, how to provide more stability services at the same or lower cost. So these are the things that that's cutting edge stuff as we go through this transition. But the point, though, is this was definitely not, when I said it's not renewables, it wasn't just a simple mismatch. It wasn't just, the sun went behind a cloud and now Spain had this huge power cut. That's just definitely not what happened.
That's very cool. So you mentioned this before, alluded to this. I want to move kind of to the solution space just briefly in the time we have left. South Australia had a problem with 41% renewables. And in their case, I mean, this is how I've heard it described. They added some battery storage, which presumably helps with a lot of those things you were talking about. And yeah, now 2 years later, they're at 70% and have a goal of 100% still, even after a catastrophic outage. So that's probably not the solution, but that is a solution. No?
Yeah,
yes?
Yes, definitely. And the nice thing about batteries is they can provide a lot of those services, those stability services, those grid services. Because, for instance, if lightning strikes a substation and you lose a whole bunch of power, the battery can very quickly, and by the way, very, very quickly, it's even a better provider of that kind of immediate support for the grid. So you can do a lot with batteries in the very short term. Of course, if you do have a mismatch, you say, well, the sun goes down and everybody wants to watch the, Australia in the, World Cup final soccer. Well, you could run a whole load of stuff off batteries for a few hours. So batteries definitely help. They won't get you through. A lot of the people sort of say, well, they're useless because they won't get you through. I mean, the thing we talk about in Northern Europe is this thing called the Dunkelflaute. It's the period, it's a German word. It's the period during winter, so there's not much sun, when suddenly you have a high pressure that sits over Northern Europe and very low winds. And so you've got no solar and very low winds. And then you say, oh, we'll just use batteries. But 2 weeks to run the German economy for 2 weeks off batteries, trust me, David, is not going to be a thing, right? Because those batteries, there'll be huge, huge amounts of batteries, huge, multiple hundreds of billions of investment, and it'll only be used once every so often. So a battery can only make money for itself if it's used often. The one in South Australia is used very often because it's providing lots and lots of services, kind of smoothing things out on a daily basis, hourly basis, minute basis, second basis, being paid for all of them. So the challenge that we've got, I actually think most of this ultimately comes down to one challenge, which is what do you do for 3, 4, 5 days, a week, 2 weeks, when there just isn't enough clean energy? And the answer is a portfolio of things. Some countries got some nuclear, some can do some biomass, biogas, geothermal, and I'm going to be honest, I think we're just going to keep some gas. We're probably just going to use gas for a few percent of the time just to make sure that everything sort of continues to work. And the nice thing about that solution is those gas generators, when they're not generating gas, the generator can still be spinning and providing some of those stability services. And so that's a really elegant solution because when you need it, you've got the backup for weeks if necessary. But when you don't need that, you switch that off, but you keep the generator running, just providing the inertia, the reactive power, all of that sort of fault. If there's a fault, then it can help with that and so on. It's a very elegant solution. I wish there was more conversation about it. We tend to think switching, let's say, coal for gas, that the plan is to switch it one for one. Great big coal-fired power station with a great big gas-fired power station. Of course, anybody concerned with climate says that's just, oh my God, you can't do that. But if you switch a great big coal-fired power station with a little bit of flexible gas and a whole bunch of wind, solar, batteries, etc., very cheap, then we ought to be able to kind of dramatically progress on climate action, on reducing emissions, whilst retaining both affordable power and resilience. And I mean, that's the holy grail, right?
Well, and you discussed this as luck would have it, and I guess it's not luck because it's right on the top of your mind. You were just discussing this in your podcast just a few days ago. You had Anders Lindberg on your show, and he talked about a very pragmatic way of looking at this. If you could just describe that, I found that one of the most interesting things I've heard in a long time.
Right. So Anders Lindberg is the head of energy for a company called Wärtsilä. And Wärtsilä is a Finnish company. Their heritage is making really big ship engines, great big things with pistons. But it turns out you can do the same thing, great big thing with pistons, and you can use it to generate power. It's very often done on, let's say, islands where they would use fuel oil, nasty smelly oil, and a big piston thing. But you can run them on gas as well. And most of their sales are now gas. So cleaner. It's actually pretty efficient, very quick to respond. You have your engine and you have a generator, right? So that's what he's got in mind. And before we talk about 2035 or whatever, let's just talk about Chile. Let's go around the world to Chile. And I was there last summer, and Chile has got fantastic solar resources. It's incredibly sunny, particularly in the north, the deserts, and it's got great wind, particularly in the south. And it's got and it's got the Santiago, the main load in the middle, and they are running 75% on renewable energy. They've got some hydro as well. There's a company called Colbún with lots of hydro, and it's fabulous. But they've still got 25% coal. Right now, why? Because the electricity price is dropping to zero most days. Why are they still using coal? Why would you do that? You're shutting down the renewables, which you've already built. They're free, and you're burning up. The reason is big inflexible plants, number one, very difficult to shut them down. They don't like going up and down. And also, they're providing these grid stability services that we talked about. So 25% coal, emissions coming from the coal, etc. Now, what Anders is talking about is saying, well, they've done all the modeling and analysis using very standard tools, not controversial at all, and shown that actually you could run that grid with, I think it was 4% of flexible gas. Now, the engines that he just happens to be selling, right? Now, those engines would run only 4% of the time, but you'd have to build quite a few of them, right? You'd have to have, and the numbers that he gave in the podcast on the YouTube, cleaning up for your listeners, you would build, I think it was something like 2 gigawatts of flexible capacity, which is about 20% of the grid, of grid capacity, but you wouldn't use it very often. Right? But all of it can provide these stability services. So the generators spin, they keep everything humming along at exactly 50 hertz, exactly the right frequency. They help with the all of the things you need help with, Rokoff, that rate of change of frequency, all of that stuff, right? But only 4% of the time they actually generate. So your emissions have gone from the 25% coal. When you go to gas, that halves it. When you go from 25% down to 4%, that divides it by another 6. So you've got 1/12 of the emissions, and the rest can all be clean. All of it can be wind, solar, using the amazing resources in Chile. Now, you can do versions of that. On the podcast, he talked about Finland. You can go around the world, every single grid that's got these big... So the key is not coal to gas. It's inflexible. By the way, many of your audience might know that as baseload, which is a horrible term, a term I hate because it's so confusing. But inflexible plants going to flexible enables the introduction of just so much more clean, cheap renewables without driving the prices up. So now the numbers that he quotes on the podcast, he says if we all do that, between now and 2050, the savings would be something like 20% of all the emissions in that interim period, and 65 trillion trillion euros, which sounds like a huge amount. Divided by 25 years, it is whatever it is, 3-4 trillion per year, but it's a lot of money. And it's largely because we stopped buying huge amounts of fuel, right?
That sounds super smart and super pragmatic, and you don't hear this very often. But you described that, or maybe it was your guest, as absolutism as the enemy, or I've heard it said as the perfection is the enemy of, how does that expression go? However the expression goes.
Perfection being the enemy of the good. This is a good solution. It's not a perfect solution because, in Chile, you'll be left with 4% generation. In Finland, I think the number was 2%, but in other places it might be 5%, might be 7%. I think it was kind of up to 10%, let's say. So it's a good solution, but it's not perfect. And the reason that the absolutism is the problem is I've already had this. As I've reflected on that episode, and I wrote a piece on my Substack, the Thoughts of Chairman Michael Substack, and some of the feedback is, you're the problem. The gas industry, we know they won't step aside. They won't, and so there's a pushback against even having 2, 4, 5, and maybe up to 10% gas, rather than here we are stuck in the world with 30-40% coal, not getting rid of that quickly, not pushing it down fast, having these ideological debates about, the answer's got to be nuclear, or why don't we all invest in fusion, or whatever it is, instead of just doing the blindingly obvious thing, which is let's make a bunch of affordable progress right now. And, the last bit, we have ways of getting rid of that last 2, 4, 5, or 10%. Right? Because you can go to clean molecules, you could go to biogas, you could go to hydrogen, which will be very expensive. You can go to ammonia, if you want to go to, you could go to green or, green ammonia, green hydrogen from renewables, or you can go to blue or turquoise from natural gas. There's all of that is going to be incredibly expensive, but at least if you're only using it for a few percent of your power demand, then 96% of the year you'll be doing cheap stuff, and then 4% you'll be doing something very expensive, but average it out and it's kind of okay. So, but you get this pushback because some people, it's almost like the problem they're trying to solve is not climate change, it's oil and gas companies. And I just think we don't have the luxury to wage these kinds of ideological conflicts.
Well, in my home province, which is one of the oil capitals of North America, they will look at this Spain thing and they will say, and we still have lots of natural gas, probably 75% or something, 22% renewables. They will say, well, that's why we need to maintain your favorite word, baseload natural gas. But what you're talking about here is the highest use of natural gas through an energy transition. And the way I put it as a layman is natural gas's job should be to facilitate cheap renewables.
That's right. And let me try and give an analogy and see if this works. That's a bit like saying, okay, the high streets, it's becoming very difficult to do like grocery stores on the high streets, right? And because of big supermarkets and out of town stores, and so now you run out of milk, and somebody says that's why we have to keep the grocer and the baker and and all of these high street stores. Whereas the correct answer is to say, no, all we need is a 24/7 down the, that will just do the milk, right? We can still have all the benefits of fabulous quality and cheap food and so on, but it's not as convenient. But all we need is one small convenience store and the problem goes away, as opposed to, trying to kind of arrest progress. So, for any listeners who are in oil and gas, got family in oil and gas, I think it's not saying I think in a way, I'm trying to sort of reconcile both positions. We do need some gas, but if you say we need to maintain big centralized baseload generators, that's wrong. We need the convenience store, right? We need the flexible gas, which, by the way, we don't mind if you need to charge a lot for it, charge a lot, because we're not going to, you don't buy milk from the convenience store very often. You don't care if it costs 2 or 3 times as much as milk in the in the big supermarket, which so I think that's the message is, go with, in a sense, I when I last came to, was in Calgary, and I said, if you've got to face the direction of travel, if you're on an escalator, you're on a travelator, you're being taken to this destination of net zero, one way or the other, you will be taken there, right? The planetary physics demands it. Society demands it, thermodynamics demands it, and so on. Now, the question is, do you want to face backwards or do you want to face the direction of travel? The direction of travel is to provide your gas or your oil and gas to support that transition, and then to be paid handsomely for that role, not to try to resist the transition.
So I just want to end up with to get a short summary from you. I guess we learned from the Spanish situation that interties are pretty important. Morocco kind of came to the rescue of Spain when all was said and done. But when people say, and you hear this all the time, it's kind of a euphemism, but we need to modernize our grids. We need to get ready for all these decentralized energy resources, and that's probably true of everywhere in the world. But what are the top 3 or 4 things we need to do? What does that mean, modernize the grids?
Well, so first of all, you're absolutely right to kind of finish by shining the light on the grid, right? Because it's not about the renewables, it is about the grid. And what's been really interesting, every single net zero or even lower carbon or whatever scenario that I've seen for the last 25 years, all of them require electrification. All of them require, at the moment, electricity provides globally 25% or so of everything we do. And all of the scenarios show that that's going to go up to 60, 70, 80% over decades and decades, right? So don't worry about it. It's not tomorrow. You won't be forced to drive an electric car tomorrow or to electrify your heating tomorrow, but they all go in that direction. And by the way, economics will drive that. The only question is how fast, right? This is definitely happening. Electrification in industry, heating, transport. I have a truck charging business. We're doing charging big rigs, 40-ton plus trucks in Europe, cheaper than diesel on a total cost of ownership basis, by choosing those routes where it works now. But I can tell you there'll be more routes next year and more routes the year after and so on. So we're going to go to electrification. And we've seen huge amounts of, literally trillions, going into renewables and into electric transportation. But the amount of investment on the grid has been flat. So our leaders have been asleep at the wheel. So first answer is invest in the grid. If you want to transform it, you're going to spend more money on it, right? You're going to have to speed up planning and get money out there and build the grid. The developed world, we've not seen increases in electricity demand for over 20 years, since about 2000. Just demand stopped growing. We had LED light bulbs and we had more efficient, lower temperature washing machines and all sorts, right? And our population growth kind of slowed. The developing world, the global south, they've seen growth, growth, growth. We're not used to it. We now need to get back to growing our grid the way we did in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and then it kind of slowed down. So invest and grow. The second thing is we've got to think about these grid stability services that we've been talking about throughout. You've got to add in the reactive power, the short circuit current, the black start capability, because we used to get those services in a sense free from the old technology, but they're not very expensive, but they're not free in the new world. So second point is we design that in. Third point is digitization, right? You talk to an old hand utility person. I'm going to say guy because most of them were guys. And you ask them, how did they used to know when there was a power cut and where there was a power cut? And it used to be based on who telephoned them to tell them that they had no power. They could work out where the power cut was because they're not calling from over there, but they are calling so it must be section whatever, right? That's old school. Now we have the ability to get data literally from every span of a pylon. Every span, we can know what temperature is. We can do weather forecasting at the level of one span of a high voltage cable. So we can make sure that it is healthy, that it's not, that there's nothing going on in terms of impingement with trees or temperature or whatever. And so we are upgrading, we are digitizing, but I think we need to do it a lot faster. So more investment in the grid, sort out the planning, more investment in the grid, make sure you've got enough of these stability services and digitize, and then take the afternoon off.
Michael, it's been a pleasure and a privilege. I've actually wanted to do this for a long time, and this was just a good excuse. So thank you very much. I just wanted to end by saying and asking, I don't know if you noticed, but we hired your former governor of the Bank of England, who wrote a book, by the way, that's a bestseller called Values. Seems to be pretty knowledgeable in this space. We just hired him as our new prime minister.
Yeah, no, we're very pleased. We trained him. We hope he doesn't let us down. He's also, by the way, he has been a guest on Cleaning Up on my YouTube channel. That was in the days in between his kind of, as I say, his training gig as governor of our central bank and his main job, which he's now pursuing, it seems, over in Toronto.
Well, thanks very much, Michael. I really appreciate it. And thanks for taking the time. It was quite enlightening.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege and an honor to be on this show. Thank you.
In its report on the massive Spanish blackout, the government said the grid operator miscalculated the correct mix of energy, and they also blamed conventional power plants using coal, gas, and nuclear fuels. Our thanks to Michael Liebreich for this interview. Subscribe to our video series on YouTube or our audio series on Spotify, Apple, or your favorite podcast service. We have more than 400 episodes on inspiring people building the new sustainable energy systems, green buildings, and transportation systems that we need to combat climate change and plot a pathway to the future. For Green Energy Futures, I'm David Dodge.